the fact that we get to see the fruition of God's promise on our atlases, on Google Earth, come on, get out of town. Like this, we're living in exciting times.
So, as you know, Raj, I read articles every day about Israel, and you know I both do, and keep our eyes on what's going on. And I came across a couple interesting articles that were sort of like a little controversial, and then also a couple articles that were more like inspiring and like, oh cool, this gives me a lot of hope, and this kind of shows a pathway forward. So I picked a few, sent them your way, as you know, and I just want to bounce them off you and get your thoughts and kind of see what may be controversial about the first two articles we're going to look at, and then check out the inspiring stories and try to figure out like how do the two coexist side by side, kind of what's going on here. So what do you think? Sound cool?
Sounds perfect.
Awesome. So the first article I found that I had some thoughts on was this recent UN resolution in which it's a new version of one that had already been rejected by the United States, Canada, Australia, other Western countries. And the big problem they had with it was that they didn't want to call what we call the Temple Mount. Jews and Christians call it the Temple Mount, and Muslims call it Al-Haram al-Sharif. And they wanted to, in this resolution, the language was very specific that they only wanted to call it the Muslim name. And yet the resolution was claiming to, want to safeguard holy sites, protect holy sites, all that stuff. And as you and I know, there is a history of the UN and other organizations, press outlets, and so on, who have a tendency to kind of downplay or even erase Jewish history, and in this case, Christian history as well, on what we call the Temple Mount. I'll just say Temple Mount throughout this, but we recognize here that it is important to Muslims as well. So wanted to get your thoughts on that. First reactions to, what's going on here? Why can't they just call it, by its name?
So I think we can really dissect this article and what exactly happened. Let me go ahead and just read the two sentences that start off this article that you sent me from the Jerusalem Post. It says, the United Nations General Assembly approved a resolution 129 to 11 that disavowed Jewish ties to the Temple Mount and called it solely by its Muslim name, Al-Haram al-Sharif. The text, referred to as the Jerusalem Resolution, is part of a push by the Palestinian Authority and the Arab states across the UN system to rebrand Judaism's holy site as an exclusively Islamic one. So I think this is, to me, the prime example of kind of what really paints a clear picture for me, right? So if you want to talk about, checkpoints, or you want to talk about settlements, or you want to talk about green lines, or you want to talk about 1967, you want to talk about whatever it might be, there are so many things that we can discuss. There are so many nuances and gray areas and different points of view. I mean, we could have seminars, and there have been, about what do we do with this? What do we do with, Bethlehem? Or what do we do with, the Dead Sea? Or how do we deal with Palestinian refugees? That's all things I think are open and valid for discussion and debate. And it's debated within Israeli society. What do we do here? What's the best way to manage this situation? But when something like this happens, to me, that supersedes a debate, right? I think there's a couple things that when people say it, it so irks me, because it's not even a debate, right? I'll go back to the article in a second. One of the other things that really bothers me, that just paints such a clear picture for me, is when people say that Jesus was a Palestinian. He clearly was not. He was a Jewish rabbi who followed the Mosaic law. He was Joseph was from the line of David. He clearly followed all the old Torah. He clearly, spoke Hebrew. He called the Temple Mount, which we're about to talk about, my father's house, this man was clearly Jewish. In fact, even the term Palestinian or Palestine wasn't really in use till about 100 years after Yeshua of Nazareth. So something like that, where you could just say, we can debate things till the sun goes down, but clearly, historically, undeniably, Jesus was most emphatically not Palestinian. However, Jesus loves Palestinians. Jesus died for, among other people, Palestinians. Some of the most passionate Jesus followers I've ever met are Palestinian, but Jesus ethnically was not Palestinian. He is Jewish. And I think another thing that we could talk about is this article where they're saying that the Temple Mount, for those of us who don't know, the Gold Dome, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the kind of the two iconic, or the Dome of the Rock, the most iconic symbol in modern Jerusalem, that whole site is only Islamic. There's two gigantic problems with that. First and foremost, history. Clearly, if you look at any of the archaeology, any of the history books, from Josephus to you go down. I mean, it is just blatantly ignoring obvious history that the Temple Mount was built by Herod around the time of Jesus, a little bit before, to be a platform for which the second temple stood. That was clearly built by Ezra and Nehemiah and those folks returning from Babylon, which was clearly the location of the first temple built by Solomon 3,000 years ago. And if you need history proven of, was there a Hezekiah, was there a David, we could go into that, from the Tel Dan Stela to the Hezekiah bullet. It's not even a debate. There is no debate. So that's the first problem. Historically, this is the Temple Mount. This is the location of the first and second temple, undeniably. And the second problem is, if you really think this is simply Al-Haram al-Sharif, ironically, you're denying Muslim history, because Islamic traditions are based off of Christian and Jewish traditions, right? You say that Jesus is highly esteemed in Islam. Well, Jesus in the New Testament goes to the temple all the time.
Yeah,
he's seen there as
that's
like a
interesting.
kid. And so if you claim to be a Muslim, you claim that this is the location of Solomon's temple. This is the location where Jesus was.
And that was even said in the literature up until the establishment of Israel. That was even in the literature that was written by the Islamic Waqf, which is the organization that controlled the Temple Mount and still does. In their own literature, it was in there. And then it was removed once Israel became a state, and they decided to deny the Jewish history that was in their own documents beforehand. So it's like you could see right there, it's a political move, really.
That's it.
And
it's purely political, not based in history.
Extremely ironic. Yeah. And what's extremely ironic to me is that I feel like the way it is now is the best way forward, to say, okay, cool, this is a holy site to the Jewish people. Christians consider it holy and Muslims consider it holy. Let's all respect each other and respect this site and kind of share it. And I feel like even the state of Israel has done a really good job of that, because up until 1967, Jordan controlled that area, right? And Jordan used that area to attack Israel, started a war with Israel. They fired the first shot. And in 67, the 6-Day War, Israel then defended themselves from Jordan's attack and gained control of that area in a defensive war. Israel did not take over the Temple Mount. They instead allowed the Islamic Authority to continue to, they had continued authority over that area, even though it was the holiest site in Judaism. Israel didn't take it over, and they could have. And instead, in an act of goodwill, they allowed the Jordanians and the Islamic authorities to retain control over that. That was a gesture of goodwill to say, we don't want to have this back and forth competition over this site. And I think that was a beautiful thing to do. And then now you have this resolution that's claiming to want to safeguard holy sites, but what they're really doing, Raj, I think, is they're shutting down debate by trying to say, no, it's only this, and no one else really has any claim to it.
And that's why I will stand on this, if you want to call it debate or whatever it might be, because it's so clearly not based in history, so clearly factual, and it is so clearly political. I was listening to a podcast with Sean McDowell, who is an Israel Collective alumni. His father's quite famous, Josh McDowell. They're two well-known Christian apologists, and he was interviewing this archaeologist who lives in Jordan and does tons of stuff in Israel and whatever. And he was saying, what's really fascinating is that you'll have two different versions of history based on where they're digging, right? So in Jordan, they'll be digging in Jordan, they'll be digging in Israel, right across the border, and they'll come to two different conclusions about something that's basically the same thing. Why? Politics. This is clearly not about history. It is clearly about politics. Because if you acknowledge that there is more or less 4,000 years of continuous Jewish history in the land of Israel, well, then who's indigenous, right? That goes the line. I think that's a debate for another time. But the point is it's so clearly not history. And we know one of the interesting things is you talk about how if Israel really wanted to, they could easily, seize the Temple Mount. And I think what's actually interesting is I've been to Israel 26 times, all over Israel, all over the West Bank. And there's only one place in all of Israel, all the West Bank, where I have been asked, what is my religion? I go up right to the Kotel, the Western Wall. No one asked me anything. I go into the Church of Holy Sepulchre, the Garden Tomb, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. No one even stops you. But the second that you're about to, maybe even accidentally, because you can kind of unknowingly almost enter the Temple Mount, I was asked by Israeli police, are you Muslim? To which I said, well, no, I'm a Christian. Sorry, you can't come here. A Jewish person asked me, a Christian person, are you Muslim? Because we're not going to upset the peace here by letting a non-Muslim onto the Temple Mount right now.
Wow.
What? But that's common. That's I've had that experience 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, and it shows how volatile that site really is, because we've talked about before, you have terror organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah and so on. One of the things they do is they allege that Israel is secretly trying to destroy what we call the Temple Mount, Al-Haram al-Sharif, or Al-Aqsa. They'll say Israel's trying to destroy it, and that's why this is a way to gin up violence among a lot of young, usually Palestinians, who've been indoctrinated for years through the school systems to hate Jews and to think that Israel is trying to, it means them harm. And that's how sensitive this area is. And we've even had, a couple of photographers on one of our trips that wandered off into an area that said, please don't walk around over here. This is extremely sensitive. I think the light was better over there or something, and they wandered over there. And within 20 seconds, again, the Israeli police were there saying, no, you cannot come over here. And this is extremely sensitive. And we're here to make sure that everything just stays chill and remains the same. And then meanwhile, you have in the UN these kind of political maneuvers that are really, I think, adding fuel to the fire, because when you make these kind of declarations, you are sending a signal that anything except the way this is worded in this declaration, which is too exclusive, it's not inclusive of all the religions that find this site holy, then you're adding fuel to the fire of these usually young Palestinian men who have been indoctrinated and think they're doing the right thing by attacking Jewish people because they think they're defending their holy site. And I see a lot of that, the complicity or the active participation in pushing these kinds of narratives. It hurts Israel, and it not only Israel, it hurts these young Palestinians who are, victims of that indoctrination.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what's really crazy is the amount of people that voted for this thing. where is it in the article? Yeah. So Belgium, okay, I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia, usual suspects, Syria. Belgium, France, Spain, Italy, Western democratic nations voted to approve this language. And that's why I think sometimes folks, not to make a general statement, but am I going crazy? Am I the only one who sees this clear? Like there are certain things that are just so clearly, and this is why people say, oh, you paint this broad brush that if you criticize Israel, everything's anti-Semitic. And no, not everything that's critical of Israel is anti-Semitic. Quite the opposite. Some of the most critical people of Israel are Israelis. But when you clearly ignore history and then approve a resolution in the United Nations that says that this is Al-Haram al-Sharif and has no mention of the Temple Mount, even though it contradicts Muslim theology, what can you say besides this is clearly a political move by the powers that be to demonize the one Jewish state? End of story.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's always tough to speak to other people's motivations. Sometimes you can't tell exactly why they're voting the way they are, and then sometimes you can, like Iran. They say they openly say they want to destroy Israel. Syria does not recognize Israel's right to even exist, let alone exist in peace and security. So their motivations are pretty clear. And then you have, some like a country like Italy, where you're like, wait a minute, this is this is where the Vatican is. Aren't they concerned with their Christian heritage being erased in this UN resolution? And it seems like that's more of a political move and more of a I think there are the people who are actively trying to destroy Israel, and then those who are complicit or tolerant of. And especially in Western Europe, it seems, I would guess that they fall more in that category, and they think if they just kind of go along with it, then the problem will just go away, because the real haters will be satisfied if we just kind of let them get their way and then move on. And that is absolutely the wrong stance to take, and it never ever leads anywhere good.
But I think a really crucial point that you made, which was, if you want peace in the Middle East, if you want to see Palestinian flourishing, which at the end of the day is what everyone wants, then you have to state truth. You have to. And so if we can come to it's not even controversial. I mean, it is because of the UN General Resolution, but this is clearly the ancient eternal capital of the Jewish people. I mean, you could write encyclopedias about the archaeology that's been discovered. You could look at ancient texts. It's like saying we don't live in America, we live in Japan. Okay, it's just so clearly not true. So if we can come to some facts, like, listen, we can talk all day long about the controversial stuff. Where does this border go? Who gets this resource? What about this hill? What about these refugees? What about this injustice? Let's talk about that. But if we can't say this is, yes, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, and also the location of the first and second temples, the first one built by Solomon 3,000 years ago by the son of David. If we can't at least say that, what are we negotiating about? You have so distorted clear historical reality that any debate will seem unreasonable to your constituents, because you have literally told them lies. I think that's why I get so passionate about this. This isn't a debate. This is facts, truth. This is the Jewish capital and has been for 3,000 years. There is Jewish history littered throughout this place. This is clearly the Temple Mount. And if we can't agree upon that, how on earth do you expect, a young 17-year-old Palestinian growing up in Hebron or Gaza to ever accept a plan that you give them, or to not pick up violence when you say, look at these people trampling our holy sites? you can't move forward for the Palestinian people while you deny the Jewish history. Otherwise, and maybe that's the goal. I don't know. I hope not. Not to be cynical, but you can't move forward until you at least stop. And again, you are denying your own history by making this political statement. That's what's so detrimental about it.
Yeah, that's a great point. It would be like saying, well, we decided that Paris is not the capital of France, and the Eiffel Tower actually belongs to whoever. It's absurd, right? Everybody knows Paris is the capital of France. It always has been. And the Eiffel Tower was built by Parisians. That's fine. So Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. What else could it possibly be? And even though even the Roman Empire tried to destroy it and rename it and was not successful, there's nothing else that it could possibly be. So if you can't,
I think one of the great examples of that, I think, with the irony, right? What's the greatest, not even arguably, the greatest ancient civilization of all time, the Roman Empire, right? And if you go to Rome, the heart of Rome, right next to the Colosseum, between the Colosseum and the Roman Forum, the epicenter of the Roman Empire is an arch built by Titus. And if you go into it and you look on the side, what do you see? You see a gigantic menorah, a gigantic 7-candle menorah that was basically taken as plunder from the temple that they destroyed in the year 70 AD. So even though the Roman Empire has been gone for what you could say 1500 years, here you have an arch that still stands in modern day Rome that is basically a tribute to the fact that the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70 AD. It's still there. You can still see this thing. And I think if there was no other history on planet Earth besides that would end the debate. But that's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to evidence of the historic reality that Jerusalem has been and always will be, the capital of the Jewish people. But that doesn't negate that there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. No one's saying that that's not the Al-Aqsa Mosque. No one's saying, hey, that gold dome, that's the Church of Minnesota. No one's saying that. Everyone knows, yes, that's the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. No one's debating that. But at least let's state the facts, which is, yes, that is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That is the Dome of the Rock. And this is the Temple Mount, the Holy of Holies, the holiest site in all of Judaism, the place that Jesus said is my Father's house.
Such an interesting thing. The Archbishop of Canterbury came out with his Christmas message, and he included an interesting thing about essentially blaming Israel for the plight of Christians in the Holy Land. And it was just so odd because when you look at the facts, the Christian community of Israel is the only Christian community in the Middle East that is growing and prospering and does have the backup of the state protecting their rights and protecting their safety. While in Syria, Egypt, Gaza Strip, West Bank, completely opposite situation. And yet he doesn't talk about that. He talks about, he somehow blames Israel for this. Thoughts?
Where does one even begin with that? We've befriended a lot of Christians in Israel, Christians in the West Bank, and it's just bonkers. It's like where do you even begin with this? You know what? I began the last one with reading a little bit of the article. Let me read a little bit of the article that you sent me, just a couple sentences. When it's talking about Christians in Israel, and here's just a couple sentences. It says, more Christian Arabs, meaning more Christian Arabs in Israel, more Christian Arabs leave school with grades that will get them in the university than any other group in the country. More Christian women attend higher education than from any other background, excelling particularly in medicine, engineering, architecture, and law. As a case in point, the first ever Arab to hold a permanent appointment as a Supreme Court justice in Israel was Salim Jubran, a Christian who sat in judgment over former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. Much of this is thanks to schools run by Christian by the Christian community itself. But it should be noted that Christian schooling is a rarity in the Middle East. In Israel, they operate freely and with the full support of the state. But if you look at the Middle East, there's one statistic. Where is it? The Christian population in the Middle East has declined from 20% a century ago to just 5% today. Let's say that again. The Christian population of the entire Middle East, the population of the Middle East a century ago was 20%. Think about that. Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran. People don't think of it this way. But a century ago, the Middle East was 20% Christian. Today, it's 5%. And you know how many Israelis are in all of those countries? 0.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the explanation for the mass
going up in Israel? Yeah, plummeting everywhere else.
Precisely.
Actually increasing in Israel. Uniquely, Israel's the only place where the Christian population is increasing, which is, I wish it was more than just Israel, but the fact that it is just Israel shows that there is something unique about Israel where the Christians in that country don't feel the need to flee, which is, it's so baffling that the Archbishop would use this imagery. And he kind of uses a little bit vague language, but essentially paints the picture of Christians are fleeing from Israel, which is patently false. The population is growing and thriving. And like you said, Raj, it's among the most successful population in Israel, even more successful than the Jewish Israelis. Meanwhile, in places in the West Bank, let's say under the Palestinian Authority, the population of Bethlehem used to be 80%. It was 80% under Israeli control. Israel used to control the West Bank. The international community screamed until they withdrew.
Josh, slow down and say that sentence one more time, because I think it's so powerful.
When Israel was in control of the West Bank, the Christian population in Bethlehem was 80%. 80%. Now it has shrunk to roughly 12%, not because of Israel's presence. Israel withdrew as the international community demanded, and the Palestinian Authority took over Bethlehem and controlled much of the West Bank, and it shrank to 12%. So the Archbishop's statement is exactly wrong. Under Israeli rule, under Israeli sovereignty, Christian communities are safe and thriving and flourishing. And under the Palestinian Authority, Christians are fleeing to almost a point of disappearing. Gaza Strip under Hamas, same story. Israel withdraws. The Christian community there, it was never huge, but it was in the thousands. Now it's down to roughly 1,000, perhaps fewer. We know Christians who've fled from Gaza and more who would if they could. Under Hamas rule, not under Israeli rule. So what the Archbishop is saying is the precise opposite of what is really happening. And again, that's damaging to actual Christians living in the Middle East. So why wouldn't you talk about them? Instead, you're just using them as a prop to ultimately demonize Israel. And I don't know if he's just mistaken or what his motivations are, but the statement is just wrong. And of all the things to talk about and kind of work into your Christmas message, you got it wrong, bro.
Well, the article that you sent started with the bombing of the Sri Lankan churches. And, I'm half Indian and most of my family friends are Sri Lankan. And I think there was, I have to look it up exactly. Let's see, 269 people died from church bombings in Sri Lanka. Doesn't talk about Sri Lanka. People in the past decade have been literally crucified for their faith in Syria, in Iraq, burned alive, beheaded, raped. In Iran, can you imagine? And if you want to talk about, hey, our Palestinian brothers need our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters need our help, cool. I couldn't agree more. They certainly do. I mean, look at the statistic you just said. our Christian brothers and sisters in the Palestinian authorities need our prayer, need our financial support, need whatever. Dude, I'm all in. I am all in for that. Sign me up. But to say that the reason that the Palestinian Christian population is shrinking is because Israel, again, I feel like I'm like talking to a brick wall. Like, it's the exact opposite. I'm not saying, hey, let's have Israel retake Bethlehem. But since Israel withdrew from Bethlehem, the population has been decimated. So what are you talking about? Again,
yeah, and by the way, I've had
saying,
people from Bethlehem tell me I wish Israel was still here.
Yeah, and, I'll never say that on camera.
No, never.
No.
And even the Arabs, mostly who identify as Palestinian, living in Jerusalem, 80 something, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's 80 something percent say they prefer to stay under Israeli rule. They do not ever want to live under any other authority. It was some study done by an American university, and I should look this up before I quote it, so I'm not going to quote it, but it was basically the premise was, well, of course they're going to tell you this. So what they did, there was an American university, unbiased, unattached, went into Jerusalem neighborhoods that would be kind of up for debate about what side they land on, Arab neighborhoods, and asked them independently, would you prefer to, when the dust settles, live in quote unquote the state of Palestine or to stay under Israeli sovereignty? And something like 80 to 90% of them said, again, double blind, we would prefer to stay in Israel. Why? Because they know and appreciate freedom. That doesn't mean they don't have a whole bunch of grievances. That doesn't mean this, again, all these qualifications. But at the end of the day, they appreciate freedom. They appreciate the ability to speak your mind. And we know that something as small as a Facebook post can get you put in prison in the Palestinian territories indefinitely. A Facebook post. And they don't want to live under that rule. So, the idea that Christian Palestinians are having a hard go with it, couldn't agree more. But let's have our message, our big annual message, be something maybe a little bit more poignant, a little bit more strategic than just painting. Let's at least talk about the facts that you and I have discussed in the past 10 minutes. Like I would talk to him like a friend, like, can we at least have this conversation where we can look at where the Christian population was under Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank and where it is now. And what you're stating, it's really damaging because it's not based in reality. Again, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't love and support and because I'll tell you what, you can attest to this too, Josh. We have a lot of Christian friends over there. There's a lot of garbage happening. But I to say it's just Israel's fault is just not true. And if you want to support Palestinians, you have to tell the truth about Israel and vice versa. Yeah, amen. Absolutely. So speaking of that, let's counterbalance this with a couple other stories that I found. I'm kind of like was doing research on the UN resolution and the other thing, and I kept running across these articles of all these things that Israel is doing to help people around the world. And I mean, you and I, we've done films about this. We talk about this a lot, but I was kind of laughing to myself because I wasn't even looking for any of that. And they just kind of kept popping up like, oh, Israel, and not just people who happen to be from Israel. I'm talking about the government of Israel. In one instance, giving computers and internet access to students in Rwanda, for example, and they spent a sizable amount. And what are your thoughts there?
I have a unique vantage point about what you're asking, simply because a lot of what I've done in the past 4 years specifically, but 7 years in general, is I've kind of gotten a front row seat into the humanitarian, philanthropic, generous heart of Israelis. I've done a lot of stories with them. I've done stories on Israelis in Guatemala, Colombia, where else we've been, Puerto Rico. So seen a lot of stuff that the Israelis are doing across the globe. And what's interesting is now that I've really become acquainted with this subject quite well, it's almost strange I'll give you an example. The tornado hit Kentucky not that long ago, a few weeks ago, and almost within, I don't know, a couple hours, the next article I saw was, "Hey, Israel has dispatched stuff to Kentucky to help." It's almost like clockwork. Typhoon hit somewhere in Asia, Israelis are on their way. An earthquake in India, Israelis are on their way. There's some Ebola in Sierra Leone, Israelis are on their way. There's a earthquake in Haiti, Israelis. There's a hurricane in Puerto Rico, Israelis. There's a Venezuelan refugee crisis in Colombia, Israelis. It's almost like any time there's a disaster or a crisis globally, it's the Israelis who are the first to show up. And what's really like a hard thing to wrap your mind around is like, okay, well, cool. Like, Israelis are just awesome at that, I guess. But put this in context. More people live in Ohio than live in Israel. More people live in Ohio than live in Israel. That's crazy. And there's not. I'm from Ohio. God bless the Buckeyes, but we're not shipping people out 24/7 like they are. And I think at the end of the day, the question is, why? Why you guys? I think it's multifaceted, but in a nutshell, is Israelis have a special expertise in dealing with trauma. Hey, it's Yom Kippur. Let's celebrate. Oh, there's the war. Hey, it's whatever. A pizza parlor blew up. Oh, hey, but it's just been this constant trauma for Israelis that they're able to now take that expertise and export it to the rest of the world. But more than that, I think it's the Jewish heart. It's the biblical. Even if they're not religious, there's something intrinsic about the Jewish people that they are a forward-thinking people. If there's any people group on the face of the earth that could rightfully be victims, that could rightfully live in the past, it would be the Jewish people. The amount of trauma and genocide and destruction that has happened to this people group, if they wanted to find their identity in their trauma or in their past or in their hurt, it could be the Israeli people, could be the Jewish people. But they're the most forward-thinking people that I've ever met, that I've ever had the pleasure of being around. And they're constantly thinking about repairing the world, tikkun olam. How do we help? How do we be a light to the nations, if you will? Mm-hmm. And I think you can try to explain it outside of the God of Israel and outside of the Bible, but I think the two are intrinsically linked, even if they don't know it themselves. And I think as long as God has chosen the people, he will be glorified in that. And so how do those two things exist? I think it's God showing off. And I think it's the real true heart of the Jewish people. Their goal isn't to conquer the Middle East. Their goal isn't to do anything terrible to anyone. Quite the opposite. They are the most forward-thinking, progress, innovative, helpful people that you will ever meet. And so to me, from the outside, it might seem kind of contradictory. Like, hey, you're talking about the entire world hating you and passing resolutions that deny your history and condemning you, and also this terrorist attack that, and all this trauma and the Holocaust and Russian pogroms and Spanish Inquisition, all you could identify as that, but you choose to identify as repair the world. I mean, if that isn't Israel in a nutshell, I don't know what is.
Well said. And the series of traumas that you've listed, the pogroms, the Holocaust, on and on, that shows that there is a persistent pattern. And when Hitler was defeated, all of that didn't just go away. And what we're seeing now is that this anti-Semitic impulse and this impulse to attack the Jewish people and deny their right to even just exist as a nation like anyone else keeps coming around and keeps kind of putting on a new mask and trying to find a new outlet. And whether that's somebody who knows what they're doing and they're doing it on purpose, or somebody who has just been kind of taken in by it and is repeating the narrative because they don't know any better, it is happening. And I think the UN resolution and the statement by the Archbishop of Canterbury are examples of that, of modern day sort of anti-Semitism that has packaged itself in a way to make it seem humanitarian, make it seem palatable, something that you'd say, oh, well, I'm a good person, I agree with that, only because you don't know the true facts. And so I hope this conversation has illuminated, the backstory behind that and shown our listeners really a way forward for Israel and the Palestinians, and also a real understanding that there is, a campaign out there to continue to delegitimize Israel and blame Israel for the problems of the world, the problems in the Middle East. And usually the people that are pushing that kind of stuff are the people that are actually to blame for for many of those things. So I'm inspired by the stories that continue to come out every day about Israel helping people around the world. It has to be one or the other. You cannot, the two cannot coexist and both be true. So we continue to see Israel doing that no matter what. And like you said, Raj, it's a part of who they are, and it's a part of their values and their identity. And that is rooted in the Bible. And so we continue on, and we'll continue having these discussions and sharing these great stories of the good things in the world, and also the things that need to be taken apart and clarified, and then come to that conclusion where we can move forward together. So thanks for the discussion, Raj. Anything else you want to add before we sign off on this one?
I think that if there's one thing that I always keep going back to, it's if you want to understand what God is up to on the Christian perspective, and you're listening to this podcast, man, read the Old Testament, understand all of Scripture. If there's a confusing thing in Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah or Deuteronomy or the Psalms, ask, search it out. But to me, if you want to see what God is up to and have this whole conversation make sense from a Christian perspective, understand what was written 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. Just live in the Old Testament, and your faith will ignite in a way that you never thought would be possible, and you'll understand so much more about what God is up to in 2022.
Yeah, you want to hear something super heavy? So
I would love to.
Psalm 83, Old Testament, written thousands of years ago, and it's going into detail about how then the different nations of the time were aligning to destroy Israel. And one of the lines that I just can never stop referring to is, come, they say, let us destroy Israel as a nation so that their name is remembered no more. That was observed and written thousands of years ago. And to me, that was the first thing that came to my mind when you see these nations coming together. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to erase the Jewish identity related to the Temple Mount.
But the thing is the name Israel should have been wiped off the face of the earth. That's why I think the world hates it. Maybe they don't know it cognitively, but it should have been. It's like the story of Gideon, where he's like, God's like, no, I don't need that many people. 300. Give me 300. Why? Because it will prove to you that it's not you, O Israel, not you, O people. It is for my name's sake and my power and my strength and my glory that I'm going to prove myself to be who I am by what I'm doing in the world right now. So to me, for me as a Christian, as a believer in Yeshua of Nazareth, to me, one of the great apologetics, what's the different word for it? The great encouragements to my faith when in a bad time is to see the modern state of Israel that should not exist logically. It is beyond illogical that exists. And yet, if you read Scripture, God said he would do this. Mm-hmm. And we're living in it. So now it's like, okay, well, yeah, it exists, but like for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that would almost disqualify your faith. It'll never be a country again. Stop it. Shut up. But the fact that we get to see the fruition of God's promise on our atlases, on Google Earth, come on, get out of town. Like this, we're living in exciting times.
We certainly are. And if that's true, then it means everything else is true as well. And it means there is hope for the world, and there is such value and such importance in what we do as believers in loving the people of the world, and what God is doing to show us the way forward that is of peace and coexistence and all those wonderful things that we all are searching for. So, man, such a good word, Raj. What a great way to wrap this one up, and can't wait to be talking with you again.
Dude, my pleasure, man. Love you, man.